Okay, hello everybody. My name is Thomas Schneider. I work for the Swiss government. I'm an ambassador and head of international relations at the Swiss Federal Office of Communication. And I'm very happy to be with you, at least virtually. Of course, I would have loved to come to Uruguay, a very beautiful and nice country with very good people. Fortunately, I'm joining only remotely, but I nevertheless try to moderate the session that hopefully is very interesting on an issue that is, of course, of very high relevance in these current times, because it is about freedom of expression during conflicts. It's about curbing of war, propaganda, and disinformation versus giving access to information on internet platforms. And we do have a number of exciting speakers that will express their views and give a few thoughts on this. And then we'll also try to have an interactive debate, knowing that this is sometimes a challenge in a hybrid format because we may not see each other. Also, I'm relying on the people on the ground in Uruguay that you help me to manage this session and signal to me when people want to take the floor from the room. And for the others, please raise your hand in the chat, in the Zoom session. And if I miss somebody, then don't hesitate to alert to me that somebody wants to take the floor, in case I have not seen you. To give you a few remarks about the session, I mean, we in the past 10 to 15 years, where online platforms, social media have developed, obviously this was a time of relative peace, and they have had the chance to establish themselves, promote themselves as neutral actors in the geopolitical era, providing access to all kinds of people that want to communicate. And now with the war in the crisis in the Ukraine, we are in an unprecedented situation as a society, and in particular with regard to these online platforms, because we see a weaponizing of information. We see an unprecedented amount of false and unproven content and propaganda. And the question is how we as a society, but in particular how social media platforms should deal with this. And we have seen them taking action through restricting access to advertisement, banning access to certain types of content. They have adopted in the past years policies on how to deal with harmful or illegal content. And we are not there yet, but it may be possible that these may develop into a kind of norm for future conflicts. And the question is, how do we want such norms to look like? Of course, we do hope that there will be no more future conflicts, but in case that there are, it would be good to have a shared understanding about how we deal with harmful or illegal content and propaganda online, in particular on social media. And of course, that poses the question of the role of such private actors versus state actors that used to have the role in defining what is legal, what is not legal, in defining procedures on content moderation and so on, and which has now shifted to private actors that struggle with this role, but also society struggles to have a shared view on what we can or must expect from such private actors. With this introductory remarks, let me directly go to our first speaker, who is Cristian Vaccari. He's a professor of political communication at the Loughborough University, as director at the Center for Research in Communication and Culture, and editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press and Politics. Cristian, you've been looking into, in particular, questions like through which principles and process we can ensure that freedom of expression is supported, enhanced online, and how we can better assess potential negative effects of different forms of online expressions, particularly in times of war and crisis. Thank you, Cristian. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to speak at this event. And like Thomas, I very much would like to be there with all of you. Since I'm the first to speak, I'm hoping to provide some reflections that can lay the foundation for our conversation, as well as providing my own perspective, which is informed not only by my research as an academic, but also as a contributor to two committees of experts by the Council of Europe, one which has just completed its work on freedom of expression and digital technology, and another one which has just started its work on how to mitigate the spread of disinformation online. And I would be referring to documents produced by the first committee in my speech. Thomas has said we're facing an unprecedented situation with the war in Ukraine. And I would argue this is the second one in a short period of time, because before that we had COVID, which obviously had very different challenges, but also led to, well, so far a lot more people dying, and let's hope it stays that way in terms of Ukraine. But it has led us and the platforms and governments to rethink about the boundaries and the compromises and the trade-offs between freedom of expression and other societal values. Facebook famously proudly allowed anti-vaxxers to post whatever they wanted before the pandemic, and then they quickly reversed course when it became clear that vaccines were our only way out of deadly situations during the pandemic, and anti-vaxxers were impeding the most important element of public response to that crisis. So we are at a time when we are making it up as we go along, and that applies to the platforms, it applies to governments, it applies to us as users, as citizens, as experts. And these are very challenging situations where a lot of mistakes are made. Now, as the saying goes, truth is the first casualty of war, and sadly, we are seeing freedom of expression being severely restricted as a result of the war. This is obviously happening in Russia with freedom suppressing legislation, but also it is happening because companies that run internet services and digital platforms have pulled out of Russia, largely as a result of the sanctions imposed by Western governments. And as a result of that, there is less freedom of expression, there's less information flowing through in the Russian public sphere. It's quite interesting. There is a webpage maintained by the Editor-inChief Center at Harvard, which chronicles the different moves that different digital companies made with regards to the Ukraine war, what to do with the Russian markets, but also what to do in terms of policies, for example, on free speech and hate speech. And it's quite clear that in a very short space and period of time, they had to make some very, very big decisions. And they have done so in a way that has been quite unsystematic, often following each other's lead, and rather than based on agreed upon principles. Because of course, we have also seen freedom of expression, or at least the flow of information slightly restricted, or the rules for that expression slightly changed in the Western world. In Ukraine itself, the Council of Europe issued yesterday its report on freedom of expression, and in this report, it mentioned that in August of 2021, Ukraine shut down a news website in a way that was criticized as lacking legal basis. We have seen across Europe Russian state propaganda websites being shut down of the main digital platforms at the request of the governments of the US and Europe and other countries. And then we have seen here in the UK, Russia Today and Sputnik losing their license, and in the rest of Europe, them being outlawed by the European Commission. We've also seen Meta, the company owning Facebook, and obviously it's a shame that we cannot engage with them in this panel, go back and forth in terms of what it would allow on its platform in terms of hate speech, first allowing people to call for, the death of Putin, for the killing of Russian soldiers or the removal of Russians. First, there's being done in 12 Eastern European countries, and then restricted to, the war zone. And we've seen a whole lot of other changes. Some of them communicated transparently, most of them not. Most of them uncovered by journalists, or around which there is still some uncertainty in terms of what the platforms allow people to do. The platforms have also been challenged to step up their moderation practices. A lot of content moderation still relies on humans, whether because they assess content specifically or because they train algorithms and machine learning tools to assess content at scale. And some of the languages that are relevant to the conflict were not particularly well represented in the apparently. And again, we don't know these things with a lot of clarity in the pool of moderators that the big platforms employ. So what these developments underlie, in my opinion, is that, as Thomas was saying, we're now in a situation where large, powerful private companies based largely in the US, sometimes acting under pressure from national governments, sometimes acting under pressure from public opinion or press scrutiny or their own shareholders or other inclinations, have become arbiters of what we can see, if not of what we can say in contemporary global public spheres. And this means that they now get to say, now they get to have a very important say on who exercises the freedom of expression as defined by Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which, just as a reminder, is freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. And so one way forward is to agree, to have a robust discussion and agree on principles around which in the future freedom of expression should be exercised in a regime where it's by and large dependent on the decisions of private corporations, but which can be limited or made more robust and more human rights compliant by self-regulation, by co-regulation, and by regulation promoted by a variety of institutional organizations. So in this context, the recommendation that has just been adopted by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe on the 6th of April on the impacts of digital technologies on freedom of expression provides some guidance and some at least starting points for discussion. And I'm going to paste a link into the chat here on Zoom, and I hope many of you have seen the recommendation, and if not, that you'll take a chance to take a look. It includes 6 sections with detailed recommendations for states and other stakeholders on how to fulfill their human rights obligations and responsibilities with regards to freedom of expression. And it focuses in particular on the foundations for human rights enhancing rulemaking, the design of digital infrastructure, the need for transparency, especially among private actors, but also public institutions, the importance of accountability and redress when freedom of expression is impinged upon, the role of education and empowerment of users, and finally, the role of and the need for adequate support to independent research so that any rulemaking that exists is based on real evidence on whether and how social media and digital platforms make a difference or not. And this is something that hopefully we can discuss in the following sections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristian. Thank you also for pointing to this new recommendation of the Council of Europe, which is of course a European document, but I think the logic that it follows may also be of interest to countries outside Europe. So yeah, I can only recommend everybody to have a look at it. And since I'm also a member of the CDMSI, the committee that's been working on it, of course, I know this document very well. With this, let me move to our next speaker, which is Eliška Pírková. She's a Europe policy analyst and global freedom of expression lead at Access Now, which is an NGO that I guess most of you know. And she in particular leads the work on content governance issues, including things like the EU Digital Service Act package that has just been adopted in the past, recently in the past days. And she's also a member of the Council of Europe's Expert Committee on Combating Hate Speech, as some of you may know. So, Eliška, I think, yeah, what we would like to hear from you is to what extent platforms are or can be neutral in such situations, what their role is, in particular in the situation of conflict, when it comes to governance of online content, what common responses of platforms are or could be. We've heard from Cristian that they tend to just follow each other and not necessarily on a facts-based or on a strategic basis, but just somebody goes first and then the others follow. So how could we improve this? And if you could clarify maybe also a little bit more about the interplay between states and online platforms in times of crisis, in particular when considering efforts to combat the spread of disinformation and other kinds of harmful content. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Maybe very briefly about Access Now, for those who are not familiar with our work. We are a global human rights organization that defends and extends human rights of online users at risk around the world. And of course, content governance and freedom of expression in times of crisis belongs to one of our priorities. And on that note, before I will move to your questions and do my best to answer all of them in very short period of time. I also would like to let everyone know that Access Now runs a digital helpline that is available to human rights defenders, activists 24/7. And on our website, you can also find digital safety guidelines in Russian, Ukrainian, and English for everyone who might find that useful. So content governance in times of crisis, I would like to maybe challenge one premise that was sort of expressed already at the beginning of this panel, and that's precisely the neutrality of platforms, which is sort of rather a myth that maybe used to be valid at the very beginning of history of internet before actually platforms became so significant in shaping public space and public discourse, and their role becomes even more important and significant in times of crisis, when the adequate access to information can actually save lives, and when often precisely these private actors are the last resort of any level of protection or possibility to gain and spread information about what's happening on the ground in these countries, as well as serves as the main tool for documenting human rights abuses, crimes against humanity. And we also know that in recent years, such an evidence was used by international judicial bodies quite widely. So I don't think that they are neutral, and I also don't think that Ukraine as such is, or the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia is to a large extent the first conflict situation that platforms find themselves in. Hardly so. The situation in Palestine, Myanmar, Ethiopia, or Afghanistan are also equally pointing out to the fact that platforms often either don't do enough or do more in rather non-transparent manner if they are subject to public pressure. And indeed, in the case of Ukraine, because the war is happening right on the doorsteps of the Western world, we see much bigger pressure, regulatory pressure on platforms to actually deliver to those expectations and finally apply some of those due diligence measures that we've been asking for a very long time. So we can all agree that in times of crisis, safeguarding human rights and guaranteeing a safe online environment for all is the priority. And as a global organization, we often see how platforms unevenly respond to situational crisis and also unevenly apply their own rules across the regions in the world where they operate. And we were able to identify a few trends that we see platforms doing under such scenarios, from non-transparent carve-outs from their own policies that have been widely reported upon also during the war in Ukraine. These carve-outs sometimes come for good reasons and for reasons that can be justifiable, but the fact that they are being made in rather non-transparent manner and that nobody really knows what are exact consequences or reasoning behind decisions that platforms take is non-acceptable due to the far-reaching consequences these carve-outs may have on the already very vulnerable population or in vulnerable groups. We often, of course, see platforms deploying context-blind automated decision-making for detecting certain type of content, including disinformation, and due to their contextual blindness and other issues connected to automated decision-making processes, we often not only that this may result into illegitimate takedowns, but especially in times of crisis, we may have lost important documentation of war crimes and ongoing human rights abuses. We also see, and that very much respond to your question about the cooperation or the relationship between state and platforms. We see overcompliance of platforms with their regulatory demands or with the state demands, with sanctions, and also how states can formally or informally shape the policies about terrorism designation lists that platforms then imply. And since these policies, again, are widely non-transparent and decision-making is not exactly made public, or they are not clearly communicated what rules actually apply, this can be highly problematic for the fundamental rights protection. More and more, we see that states as well as platforms understand the power of their own business models. And in the context of Ukraine and Russia, it was also nicely, we could observe how some platforms, and especially those that have a huge impact and whose business models is very much standing on the AdTech industry, and how they actually post certain advertisements in these regions. And we also see the recognition how content recommender systems, so the automated systems that curate information, so in other very simplistic words, what you see in your news feeds, what kind of information is being delivered to you, and on what basis and parameters. So we saw as well that the platform started taking certain changes within their content recommender systems, because it's precisely this business model in a combination with these automated systems that are often behind the spread of disinformation or amplification of disinformation and propaganda online. And what we see again and again, despite number of comments and critique and recommendations, we still see comparatively little resources allocated to small market countries, as well as to minority languages, which then again translates to all those other potential spaces for human rights abuse, whether due to the lack of content moderators who actually properly understand the context of the country and master the languages that are needed in that particular context, to also automated decision makings that are being trained on the insufficient training data and then committing mistakes that I've already mentioned. And finally, perhaps what is truly essential, and it becomes even more important in times of crisis, and that's the meaningful engagement and cooperation between platforms with trusted partners on the ground, organizations with the sufficient expertise, with those who are actually very familiar with everyday reality in that particular country. And all over again, despite of our demands, we see inadequate response by platforms and very not deep enough cooperation with trusted partners. We see lack of appeal processes. We also see lack of international human rights standards, oversight practices, and also too little interest in actually joining the forces with trusted partners and with the local expertise that could then be translated into the policies of these platforms. And I'll conclude there. It's very important to realize that these issues that I've just mentioned have been prevailing and are common practices or common issues in a way how platforms actually regulate free expression or fundamental rights in general. But especially in times of crisis, whether that's war or that's conflict and other type of crisis happening on the ground, these issues became even more relevant because they can actually have a very negative impact on human life. And even though this situation might seem unprecedented, there are already recommendations in place, such as more due diligence safeguards on the side of platforms that can actually mitigate those issues. So I will stop there, and I look forward to further the conversation.
Thank you, Eliška, for these very relevant remarks. Let me not lose time and quickly go to Guy Berger. Guy Berger is the Director of Policies and Strategies in the field of communication and information at Unesco. So Guy, I understand you're in the room. Yeah, I'm seeing you. Hello. So of course, Unesco has decades of work in this field. What is Unesco's position in terms of international standards of freedom of expression regarding conflict times and conflict zones? And another question that would be interesting to hear Unesco's experience of you is what we've touched several times now is the role of the state versus the role of private actors. We've had this already in the traditional world, but now it's slightly different because we are not dealing with local newspapers. We're dealing with mostly global companies that are not always rooted, as we've heard, in a particular small country. And then finally, the role of internet intermediaries on all levels of tech and today's communications. What is most important? What do we need to do in this situation from a UNESCO point of view? What exists and what do we need to create? Thank you, Guy. The floor is yours. I cannot hear you. I don't know whether you have to unmute. Can we get the mic
to work? Technicians, please.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
That's good. I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, and greetings to people participating here. I'm Guy Berger. I work at UNESCO. Interestingly, UNESCO, when it was set up, it was created before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it promoted in its constitution free flow of information, not simply as an entitlement to which all humans should be privileged to have, not privileged, but legally entitled. But it was seen also as freedom of expression being the key to peace and to mutual understanding. And I think this is important because it came out of the Second World War experience where two countries could indoctrinate their populations for war, Germany and Japan, because there was no press freedom, there was no freedom of expression. And they very successfully did that. And so I think what we can take from this is that freedom of expression, we know it's a really serious right. It should be limited under extremely limited conditions, which I don't have to tell you about, all that. But it's also got an instrumental significance for peace. And to give a small example, if we take historically a war like the Vietnam War, which went on a long time, ultimately public opinion in the US shifted because there was a free media, there was free discussion. People decided we've got to end this war. This, I think, bears out this fundamental premise that freedom of expression is good for peace. So if people are enabled to have pluralistic and reliable information, I think we can generally say that's good for peace. And I think that the internet companies would be very well placed to think about this because I'm sure they don't want to become factors where they are digital threats to peace and digital threats to journalism. And I think that they also need to think about this, particularly because there's the UN guiding principles on human rights, business and human rights, which applies to the private sector. And these apply not just to the platforms which we've been talking about. They apply to all private actors, including other digital actors. Let me mention ISPs app stores, VPN providers, search. The whole tech stack is implicated by the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. And what do these principles say? They say, do a human rights assessment. Now, this is not just empty words. This is profound. Because if the digital companies were doing regular human rights assessments, they could not be reactive, they could be preemptive when trouble comes. It doesn't help to only moderate and mitigate when there's a problem. If you do human rights impact assessments in advance, there are lots of things you can do which can actually play a positive role for peace. I'll give you 3 examples here. One is, it's not rocket science to see that there are conflicts brewing. You can see it also, first of all, when freedom of expression is shut down. That's a warning sign that perhaps there's going to be indoctrination for aggression. So if you do your human rights impact assessment, you can say, this is country X and country Y, or even an internal country. What are the languages that we need to be monitoring here? You have to beef up your capacity. You have to train people for moderation. It's not easy to do that. Certainly once the conflict started, it's too late. So do your human rights impact assessment up front, in advance. You know, this is key. That's one example. Second example, companies need to think about security issues. And I think the human rights impact assessments can help this. For example, we know that there's lots of innocently generated metadata in this digital space, which can be used and mined for military purposes. Companies need to think about this. Are they providing resources that can enable targeting of particular individuals or particular installations through the metadata? Companies need to also think about strengthening their encryption systems. They need to think about, for example, beefing up their detection systems for coordinated inauthentic behavior, your orchestrated information operations. They can do all this if they do in the advanced thinking, the preparation of an impact assessment. The last example I want to give, they should anticipate scenarios for blockages, filtering blockages and so on, for shutdowns, and even military action against internet infrastructure. So a lot of people have said in the case of Ukraine that if the internet infrastructure gets knocked out, Elon Musk has put up his space link. But you know, last year Russia shot down a satellite, its own satellite. You have to think, if you are Elon Musk or if you're any internet service provider, what will you do if you're providing satellite-based internet access and things become so conflictual that one side thinks it's worth starting a space war? These are very serious things that the companies need to think about. And if you do this advanced human rights assessment, I think you'll get that. Now, that's before the conflict. When the conflict starts, companies obviously have to apply their policies clearly and consistently. I want to just, it's a pity Meta are not here, but you cannot mix up policies here. Meta have a hate speech policy, they have incitement to violence policy. These are not the same things. Hate speech, we know, is, for example, all Russians should be killed. We hate the Russians. Incitement to violence is, let's fight the invader, or that kind of thing. Now, these are quite different. So what you saw in the case of Meta, they said, we are suspending our hate speech policy in certain cases. Yeah. Now, I'm sorry, but I don't think there's anything in international law that says hatred is legitimate. Hatred against all Russians, for example. No. We could say we're going to tweak our incitement to violence policy because there is an international right to self-defense. But what we saw in this case was really, in my view, ad hoc policy positioning and mixing these policies. And by the way, I think we also need to be very careful because disinformation and propaganda for war are also not exactly the same thing. We have to think about that because, again, you have different policy prescriptions there. Now, I'm going to wrap up in a minute. It's been mentioned, of course, that companies, internet companies, need to be very much on the ball, moderating content, monitoring, and so on. And it was mentioned also about how the algorithmic recommender systems also need to be monitored, because in many cases, even despite the best will of the companies, these may be fueling polarization, fueling hate, and in fact, putting advertising in, and some of the people driving the conflict are making money out of it. So companies need to be monitoring this particularly, and what's particularly important is disclosing it, saying what they've actually been finding and what mitigation. Because accountability and transparency don't go away just because there's a conflict. Accountability and transparency don't go away just because there's a conflict. Companies really have to take this seriously. I've got a few more points. Let me just make one, though. Fact-checking, of course, is extremely important in situations of conflict. As was said, truth is the first casualty of war. But you're speaking now about not so much individual facts, but narratives, which is a combination of a lot of things, not just isolated facts. It's how they spun, it's how they interpreted, it's what they combined with. And that requires a bit of a different approach, I think. And I just want to give the example here of what happened in the US with the storming of the Capitol. So you saw a situation in the build-up to the storming of the Capitol. There was a lot of trending of stop the steal. Now, that's not per se illegal, but it started to be combined with bring your guns, bring your bear spray, we're going to seize power in Washington. Now, the companies have the artificial intelligence to be able to see when something is beginning to scale and fuse towards incitement to violence. And they could have taken preemptive action. This is a point made by Susan Benesch, who's an expert on hate speech. But they didn't. And this really requires companies to be much more proactive in terms of how they understand the way that people are using their platforms, how their own platforms might be fueling the fire, as I say, generating money. So there are lots of things that I think platforms can do if they want to be factors for peace rather than digital threats to peace. So thank you, Ambassador. Back to you. Sorry, I have one more point. It's not my point. I believe that we have a Ukrainian journalist here who is very knowledgeable about how the platforms were acting. And not only platforms, I hope you maybe mention some other levels of the tech stack. This is Ms. Alla Sadovnik, and I'm told that she would like to intervene from the floor. So, Ambassador, you're the moderator, if you are happy. I'm told she is here, she's right here in Uruguay, and she'd like to make a comment. Over to you, Ambassador, if you want to pass the floor to her.
Yes, thank you. And I've got the same information, so no worries. I will give her the floor very soon. Just 2-3 words to try and sum up, and then I think it's time to open the floor to all participants. But I think one of the key elements is that there are no clear rules for platforms on how to behave. There are no clear standards. Of course, these standards, there is growing number of soft law from Council of Europe, from UNESCO, and also from other bodies maybe, but in particular from these two on some standards. We have the Rocky principles, the guidelines for business, as you said, but that may not be enough to guide private actors with such a power in such situations to get the balance right. And they do not always get the balance right, obviously. And so I would like to hear also your views on what is needed. Again, what is needed? How do we get the global community to develop standards that make sense, that are reasonable, and that are, to the extent possible, implementable? And the second point is, is that, as you rightly say, it's illegal content is something that is already a difficult issue, but it's much easier to ban than disinformation or misinformation, because in a democracy, basically, to tell a lie is not forbidden. That's part of freedom of expression. And as we say in my country, what is true or wrong is not at the beginning of the debate, but it's the result of a debate. So it's not necessarily in our perception up to the government to say what is right or wrong. Of course, there are statistical facts and numbers that you can prove or refer to a scientific process. But when it comes to interpreting facts, then of course, in particular, then the truth should be, or whatever the society considers truth, should be the debate, the end of a debate. And of course, the lines are blurring, and the example of the capital Stop the Steal is the lines between freedom of expression and between incitement to action, to violent action, of course, is difficult to take. Before I give the floor to Ali, but maybe just a quick handover to Rodica from the Council of Europe, because the Council of Europe has just adopted also a recommendation on hate speech, and it may be interesting just to give her 1 minute to explain what this is about and how this could contribute to developing a more coherent regulatory guidance for platforms and for us in this regard. So Rodica, I understand that you're in the room, so please take the floor and then hand it over directly to Alia Savokic from the UK. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, it works now. Thank you. Good morning to everyone from Uruguay. I don't know if you see me. First of all, thank you to everyone for being here, and thanks to Unesco for organizing this session with the Council of Europe. Just 1 minute to announce of this important recommendation that has just been approved by the deputies in Strasbourg and will be finally adopted by ministers in Turin. It is a recommendation on a comprehensive approach to address hate speech, including in the online environment, so very relevant to what we are discussing. And in fact, it does address internet intermediaries along with states and other actors, basically underlying the huge responsibility that they have in ensuring the human rights respect and protection against hate speech online. It also looks at measures to be taken into account, and that relates to the specific context of hate speech, of course, the severity of the expressions and the harm it causes. And the platforms should constantly monitor the situation online, adopt tailored and evidence-based measures to address and prevent hate speech. And of course, it looks also at the effective remedies, sanctions, and versus perpetrators in line with the legislation. Another important thing, they should also be encouraging and optimizing an alternative speech, which means education and awareness raising. That's it from me. If you allow, Thomas, I will pass the floor directly to Ala, who is this Ukrainian journalist with us here today. Thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone, and I want to thank all of you who support Ukraine, and it's really important for us to understand that we aren't alone now. And we have a war from 2014 in Ukraine, but when full invasion started 24th of February, we changed very much. This war touched everyone in Ukraine, and what is happening with us, this has changed how we react in social media, how we react in internet, and how journalists work now. So we are very self-censored now. We weren't so before the full invasion. Ukrainians are very free lovers, really, and sometimes many of us don't understand the line between freedom of expression and like hate speech, and we love criticizing everything, including our presidents, our government. We didn't like any government we had. It's changed too now because we are very united. at that moment. And you mentioned it a few times that there are so many hate speeches already from Ukrainians to Russians, including like kill Russians or kill Putin. Yes, I'm sorry for this, but you have to understand what we are feeling. And when people lost their families, when they lost their houses, the way to say those words, it's like maybe a only way to make them feel a little better. And it's wrong, I know, but on the same time, we don't have to forget what's going on in social media in Russia. And I saw those many messages from them that you have to kill Ukrainians, you have to rape Ukrainian women, we support what Russian soldiers are doing in Ukraine. So it's two sides of a stick. About the platforms and self-censors. So when the war started, Ukrainians were asked not to write where the rockets hit, what was exploded, how many people were killed without official information. And like after 2 or 3 weeks after full invasion started, all Ukrainians stopped to do this. So yesterday we had many rocket attacks in Ukraine, and I was here and I saw that people started to write that we hear the bomb explosions in different cities in my country, and I just checked and checked and checked, trying to understand what was happened. And I saw that people, even when someone just wrote that, oh, it's in my district, in some particular part of Lviv, for example, under those comments will be like tens or even more comments just to asking the moderator to delete this, and just to asking not to write exactly place where it happened, because it's safety measures. And Ukrainians were asked to not help Russians to understand, did they like do what they wanted, or they need to send another rockets to that place. And journalists do the same. So before the full invasion, when something was happening, all websites, all journalists, all TV stations, they were very competitive. Who will be the first on the place? Who will be the show of the brightest picture? Who will be ask more people, ask more officials for more comments? We don't do this anymore. So we are waiting for official comments, and we are okay if those comments aren't full enough, because we understand it's all about our safety now. Before the full invasion, it was like the most popular social media, Facebook, Instagram in Ukraine, not Twitter, unfortunately. And people communicated there mostly, and many of them received information and news from those platforms. Now I believe that the most famous is Telegram channels. And if Meta and Twitter can react, for example, for hate speech, and they have the rules, I don't think that anyone control what's going on Telegram channels. And Russians use them too. So I think it's one of the questions we need to discuss, what to do with, for example, these Telegram channels, how to be sure that those platforms will not to create something terrible. And the other things, the last, I guess, I wanted to say that it's not now about how to access the truth, the true information. It's more about how to access any information at all now, because when Russians occupied some territories in Ukraine, they shut down cell phone connections and electricity. So even near Kyiv, the towns and villages that were occupied, some of them still on the previous week didn't have the cell phone connections. So people didn't have any news to the moment Ukrainian soldiers came to the villages and said that they are free already. And even with Starlinks, you need electricity. So it's something new we are faced with in Ukraine, and I hope that what we are going through will bring some answers for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alia, for this very impressive insight from somebody that experiences a situation that we most of us have fortunately not have had to experience. So thank you very much for sharing this with us. And again, you raise a number of issues. We are basically running out of time, but we do have 5 to 10 minutes left, if I understand right. And I think one point that you raise that makes the situation in a conflict case even more difficult is that, and that is not necessarily new, that media become part of a defense or of an attack logic of a country or of a party or of an aggressor or of somebody that's trying to defend itself. That has already been the case in previous cases, but at that time it was easier for the government or for the military to control media. Now there are means that people can actually, it's almost impossible, at least for a democratic government that also in times of crisis that tries to control media, because people have other channels where they can pass information as long as the networks are up and you have electricity. So also there, I think we are confronted with new situations, or at least new versions of situations that ask for a clearer shared vision of how to cope with such situations. And of course, it's the Telegram issue is something that is also gaining importance, because the more, let's say, the public or semi-public platforms, social media, regulate themselves or become regulated, the more those that do not want to respect such kind of regulation, they go to private channels where there's no control at all. And I mean, that is obvious, and that poses new question. Also there, I'm to some extent historian. You had like the secrecy of a letter, you had that before, so people always could communicate privately, but that was at a completely different speed. And of course, you can also have Telegram groups where you have more than just 2 persons on it. So it is a kind of a semi-public sphere, but one that is completely out of the scope of those who are not in it. And that raises a number of questions, I think, where we have no standards at all, because it's a new situation where these kind of channels have become so popular and so powerful, or been used by so many people. So I think you raise a number of issues that we need to look at on European, on global level, in all regions in the world where conflicts are already existing or may exist, because there are some new dimensions that have been added. I don't know, do we have other requests for the floor in the room? Somebody could tell me.
I have a request. My name is Leif Lundsmann. I'm a citizen and a journalist in the Kingdom of Denmark. Due to my constitution, I have the right to seek and receive information regardless of content and regardless of borders. Since beginning of March, I guess the EU banned my access and restricted my access to information from 2 Russian sources, Sputnik and Russia Today, RT. I would like the panel to elaborate or comment on that restriction, if that's a breach of my right, according to Article 19, to seek and receive information regardless of content and borders.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to the panelists for a closing round, let me just share you also on this one. This is a very good question, because I work for a government that has decided we took over basically all of the EU sanctions, but not this one. And the logic was that in Switzerland, unlike some countries, at least in the EU, where it may be a problem of inner security to have propaganda through such channel, this is not necessarily a big risk in Switzerland. And our government decided that they would not ban it completely, because it was the feeling that our society should be able to cope with this and also be informed about what propaganda looks like in order to develop appropriate responses. Of course, our case, as I said, is different from people from countries in the Baltic states or the neighbors of Ukraine and Russia, of course. But there are pros and cons of this, and this is a very legitimate question. Also, the fact that, of course, then what aboutism goes on, and they say, well, you do the same, just like us, you just ban whatever you don't like. Of course, this is not the case, because there are different criteria behind banning, and some of them are actually international law that force you to ban certain content if it crosses a certain line. But the question is legitimate. With this, let me maybe quickly give the floor to the three panelists. We've got 2 minutes each to tell us, what are your takeaways? What did you learn in 1 minute? And the second minute, what do we need to do, or what can we do rather? Thank you. We follow the reverse order now. Guy, you first, then Eliška, and then Cristian, but please stick to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ambassador. I'll just make one point which was very interesting to me. This question of Telegram, which, as people know, is encrypted, and also, as I understand, has no limits on, no friction in terms of the number of people in a group and the number of times you can share. So what is the role of a Telegram in regard to its responsibilities under the guiding principles for business and human rights? So I think, first of all, sharing content indiscriminately at speed is not a human right. And so what WhatsApp have done, they've limited the amount, they've introduced friction, they've limited the amount of stops that or destinations that a single piece of content can go to. Of course, this is content blind. It's blocking maybe good campaigns, but it's also blocking campaigns for war. There's no reason why there could not be some kind of regulation of Telegram to do the same. And that's not a content regulation. The problem with content regulation and Telegram is that, of course, it's encrypted. Apart from all the dangers of, do we want companies to make these decisions? But what I think you could perhaps do is not regulate to break the encryption, but to regulate, to give some prominence to verified sources. Like when the UN is calling for an end to the war and peace, to put that message, every time a person goes on Telegram, that message is there. I'm just giving this as an example. So this is not the intervention to limit or restrict what's going on in Telegram, content-wise, but it's a way that the company can, as I said, play a part that it's not a digital threat to peace. It's part of a digital solution to peace. Thank you. I don't know what's happening there. We've lost.
Can you hear us again?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Yeah, it seems that we lost connection. So you've been a little long, guys, so there's only 1 minute left for the two others. Life is not always fair. Next time we'll do the reverse order again. Thank you. So Eliška, please.
Thank you very much. There are so many important topics that I could address, from the due diligence safeguards and the human rights impact assessments that are already mentioned. I think equal, or ideally they would be ex ante and they would be mandatory, but that remains to be seen in the future. I also would like to perhaps emphasize, because we unfortunately couldn't hear the complete answer of the first speaker now, but when it comes to regulation, and especially regulation of content governance and freedom of expression, that always goes hand in hand with the state of the rule of law and protection of democratic principles in that particular country, and the law and the regulation can be equally abused. So I think that, and we see that often, so the state regulation certainly matters, but so does self-regulation of platforms, and for both these principles that should be compliant with the human rights, whether United Nations guiding principles that have been mentioned that also put the emphasis on human rights impact assessments, are equally important in that regard. As for Telegram, I do agree that there is definitely a gap that we ourselves need to tackle due to the fact that it gained extreme importance, especially in situation of conflict, and private messaging apps as well. However, and I'm sure that that was not the point, but I just want to emphasize that encryption here is here for protecting people's safety. Any kind of solutions that would lift encryption or weaken encryption will always miss their mark. This is not to say that we should not look for the better regulation or better control over private messaging apps, but weakening encryption is always that end. Encryption means safety of online communication, and it's good for the fundamental rights. And finally, there is a long way ahead of us, and indeed platforms are taking solutions and decisions about how to interpret hate speech or how to interpret incitement to violence and other illegal content prohibited by international law. And nowadays we even see platforms interpreting what is international armed conflict and what is non-international armed conflict. I think the oversight is the key here. We need to decide whether we want to have private actors deciding on how the law and how the rights should be protected. And if we want that public scrutiny, then we also need to decide who is best positioned to exercise that level of oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliška. Cristian.
Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I'm very grateful to have been part of this panel. I want to, again, pick up on Telegram. I think it's incredibly important that we take stock of the private messaging apps. Telegram is a particular one because it doesn't all
the connection is lost here in Uruguay. We can see you, but we don't hear you. I don't think the sound is going to come back, so let me thank you on behalf of Council of Europe and UNESCO for coming to the session here in Uruguay. I hope you found it really interesting and keep up the debate.
Can I? Yes.
Actually, I was happy. It means that we really need now to also do much more on this encrypted application.
You understand, of course, people feel that hatred, but
I think they might be coming back right now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We had a very nice conversation among us here in the online world. So I guess you need to close the session in Uruguay. So thanks a lot. Just my final word that I was saying is that the EU attempt to solve platform issues via the Digital Services Act, via regulatory competition policy is an interesting one, but we may also have to find the media policy, a space for the media policy component, which the EU may have problems in delivering. So thinking about a Council of Europe instrument, maybe a new version of the Transfrontier Television Convention adapted to the challenges that we have may actually be, which would also be open to signature from non-European countries, maybe an instrument that we could think about, because I think we definitely have to do something, but do the right thing and not something that makes the situation even worse than it already is. So with this, I think that's the beginning of the discussion. It's the end of this session, but the beginning of the discussion that we will continue to have in a number of international fora between experts and so on. So thanks a lot.
Hello, good afternoon. Thomas, Eliška, how are you all?
Fine, thank you.
Great to see you.
Hello.
Lovely to see you.
Very well, very well.
Okay.
Are you in Montevideo?
I think we need to cut now because we're getting some interference. Thank you from Uruguay. I hope you hear us now. We also missed some of your last remarks, but maybe we can find a way to reinsert the audio when this thing goes online. So from us here in Uruguay, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. And support peace. Bye.
Many thanks. Bye.
Thank you.